Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 292 of The Pulp Writer Show. My name is Jonathan Moeller. Today is February the 27th, 2026. And today we are taking a digression into history by looking at the 4 Thomases of the English Reformation with one bonus Thomas. We'll also have Coupon of the Week and a progress update on my current writing and publishing projects. First up, let's do Coupon of the Week. This week's coupon code will get you 25% off the ebooks in the Dragon Skull series at my PayHip store. And that coupon code is QUEST25, QUEST25. And as always, the links to the store and the coupon code will be available in the show notes of this episode. And this coupon code is valid through March the 9th, 2026. So if you need a new ebook this winter, we have got you covered. Now for an update on my current writing, publishing, and audiobook projects. I am very nearly done with Cloak of Summoning. As of this recording, I am 35% of the way through the final editing pass. And this episode should be coming out on, March the 2nd. And so I'm hoping Cloak of Summoning will be available a few days, hopefully like 1 or 2 days after this episode goes live, but we'll see how things go. In any event, it should be out in very early March, which is not far away at this point. I am also 14,000 words into Blade of Wraiths, the 4th book in my Blades of Ruin epic fantasy series, and hopefully that will be out in April if all goes well. That's my secondary project right now, but once it gets promoted to primary project, once Cloak of Summoning is available, my new secondary project will be Dragon Mage, which will be the 6th book in the Riva Half-Elven Thief series, and I'm looking forward to that since it is going to bring to an end a lot of ongoing plot threads, so it should be quite a fun book to write and hopefully to read. And that should hopefully be out in May or possibly June, depending on how things go. In audiobook news, Cloak of Titans, the audiobook narrated by Hollis McCarthy, should be available in more audiobook stores than it was this time last week, though it's still not on Amazon, Audible, or Apple. And Brad Wills is working on recording Blade of Storms, and I think the first 6 chapters are done. And hopefully we should have those audiobooks available to you before too much longer. So that is where I'm at with my current writing, publishing, and audiobook projects. Now, without further ado, let's get to our main topic, and it's time for another of my favorite topics overall, a digression into obscure points of history. I've mentioned before that Wolf Hall, both the TV show and the book, is a lot easier to understand if you are at least passingly familiar with the key figures of the English Reformation, which happened during the reign of King Henry VIII. But who were these key figures? I had a history professor who said that to understand the English Reformation, you need to know about the 4 Thomases of the English Reformation: Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Thomas Cranmer, since each one of them altered events in a major way. Fun fact: only one of the 4 died from natural causes, and right before he was about to go on trial for treason, which would have likely ended with his execution. The English Reformation was a tumultuous time, and the Tudor court was not a place for the faint of heart or the morally scrupulous. So let's talk about the 4 Thomases and one bonus Thomas today. But first, to understand them, we should look at 3 background trends that converged and boiled over during their lifetimes. Number 1, Henry VIII needs an heir. King Henry VIII was quite famously married 6 times and executed 2 of his wives in his quest for a male heir. To the modern ear, this sounds odd and chauvinistic, but one of the errors of studying history is assuming that the residents of the past had any interest in 21st century standards of behavior. By the standards of Henry's time, having a male heir to assume the kingdom after his death was absolutely vital. In fact, an argument could be made that Henry was attempting to act responsibly by going to such lengths to father a male heir, though naturally he went about it in a spectacularly destructive and self-absorbed way. Remember, Henry's father, Henry VII, came to the throne after a 30-year civil war, and there were noble families that thought they had a better claim to the throne than the Tudors and would be happy to exercise it. A good comparison is that the lack of a male heir for Henry VIII was as serious a crisis as a disputed presidential election in 21st century America would be. You can see evidence for this in Henry's famous jousting accident in 1536. For a few hours, people were certain that he was dead or was about to die, and this incident caused a brief constitutional crisis. If Henry died, who would rule? His daughter Mary, who he had just declared a bastard? His young daughter Elizabeth from Anne Boleyn? His bastard son Henry Fitzroy? A regent? One of the old families who thought they had a claim to the throne? Now these are the sort of questions that tend to get decided by civil wars, which nobody wanted. So Henry needed a male heir, and he weighed on him as a personal failure that he had been unable to produce one, which was undoubtedly one of the reasons he concluded that several of his marriages had been cursed by God and needed to be annulled. Though, of course, one of Henry's defining traits was that his self-absorption was such that nothing was ever his fault, but a failing of those around him. Trend number 2. The Reformation is here. At the same time Henry was beginning to have his difficulties, the Protestant Reformation exploded across Europe. The reasons for the Reformation were manifold. There is a growing feeling across all levels of society that the church was corrupt and more concerned about money than tending to Christ's flock, a feeling not helped by the fact that several of the 15th and 16th century popes were essentially Renaissance princelings, more interested in luxury, money, and expanding the power of the papal states than in anything spiritual. Many bishops, archbishops, abbots, and other high prelates acted the same way. The situation the early 16th century church found itself in was similar to American higher education today. Many modern professors and administrators go about their jobs quietly, competently, and diligently, but if you want to find examples of corruption, folly, and egregious waste in American higher education, you don't have to try very hard. Reformers could easily find manifold examples of clerical and papal corruption to reinforce their arguments. Additionally, nationalism was beginning to develop as a concept, as was the idea of the nation-state. People in England, Scotland, Germany, and other countries began to wonder why they were paying tithes to the church that went to build beautiful buildings in Rome and support the lavish lifestyle of the papal court when that money might be better spent at home. For that matter, the anti-clericalism of the Reformation was not new and had time to mature. At the end of the 14th century, Lollardy was a proto-Protestant movement in England that challenged clerical power. In the early 15th century, the Hussite Wars in Bohemia, following the teachings of Jan Hus, were a preview of the greater Reformation to come. Papal authority had been severely damaged by the Great Schism at the end of the 14th and the start of the 15th century, when two competing popes, later expanding to three, all tried to excommunicate each other and claim control of the church. In the aftermath, Renaissance humanists had begun suggesting that only the Bible was the proper source and guide for Christianity, and that papal authority and many of the church's practices were merely human traditions that had been added later and were not ordained by God. A lot of the arguments of the Reformation had their earliest form from the writers of the 15th century. Essentially, the central argument of the Reformation was that the believer's personal relationship with God is the important part of Christianity and doesn't need to be mediated through ordained priests in the official sacraments of the church, though such things were still important. Of course, all the various reformers disagreed with each other about just how important and of what nature that relationship was, how many sacraments there should be, and what the precise relationship between the individual, the church, and the state should be, and that argument got entangled with many other issues like nationalism, but that was the central crux of the Reformation. So all these competing pressures had been building up, and when Martin Luther posted his statements for debate on church reform in October of 1517, it was the equivalent of lighting a match in a barn that had been stuffed full of sawdust and was suffering from a natural gas leak. And our third trend, the printing press. So why did Luther's action kick off the Reformation as we know it, and not the other proto-Protestant movements we mentioned? I think the big part of that is the printing press, perhaps the biggest part. The printing press did not exist during the early proto-Protestant movements, which meant it was a lot harder for the ideas of reform to spread quickly. The Lollards, in particular, wanted to translate the Bible into English instead of Latin, but the Bible is a big book, and that is a lot of copying to do by hand. In 1539, after a lot of encouragement from Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII decreed that an English Bible should be placed at every church in England. In 1339, that would have been an impossible amount of copying by scribes. In 1539, thanks to the printing press, it was essentially on the scale of the government embarking on a mid-sized industrial project. Perhaps a bit of a logistical and organizational challenge, and you have to deal with contractors, but by no means impossible. The printing press made it possible for the various arguments and pamphlets of the reformers to spread quickly throughout Europe. Luther published tracts on a variety of religious and political topics for the rest of his life, and those tracts were copied, printed, and sold throughout Europe. In fact, he had something of a flame war with Thomas More over Henry VIII's defense of the seven sacraments. Kings and governments frequently tried to suppress printers they didn't like, but the cat was out of the bag, and the printing press helped drive the Reformation by spreading its ideas faster than had previously been possible. AI bros occasionally compare modern large language model AIs to the printing press as an irreversible technological advancement, but one should note that the printing press of the 16th century did not require an entire U.S. state's worth of electricity and an unlimited supply of water. So those were some of the undercurrents and trends leading up to the English Reformation. With that in mind, let's take a look at our four Thomases. Number 1, Thomas Wolsey. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was Henry's right-hand man during the first 20 years of his reign, and essentially the practical ruler of England during that time. He started his career in Henry's reign as the almoner, essentially in charge of charity, and it ended up becoming the Lord Chancellor of England. Since Henry was not super interested in actually doing the hard work of government, Wolsey ended up essentially running the country, while Henry turned his full enthusiasm towards the more ceremonial aspects of kingship. Wolsey was an example of the kind of early 16th century church prelate we mentioned above, more of a Renaissance princeling than a priest. However, as Renaissance princelings went, you could do worse than to have been ruled by someone like Wolsey, and if you were a king, you would be blessed to have a lieutenant as diligent in his work as the cardinal. Granted, Wolsey did amass a large fortune for himself, but he frequently patronized the arts, education, and the poor, pursued some governmental reforms, and deftly maintained England's position in the turbulent diplomacy of the time. He was also much more forgiving in questions of religious dissent than someone like Thomas More. Wolsey was the most powerful man in England at his apex, and the nobility hated it for him because his origins were common. So long as he had Henry's favor, Wolsey was untouchable, and the nobility couldn't move against him. But the royal favor came to an end as Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was unable to produce a son. Since Catherine had previously and briefly been married to his older brother Arthur before Arthur's death, Henry became convinced, or succeeded in convincing himself, that his marriage was cursed by God for violating the prohibition against sleeping with your brother's wife in the book of Leviticus. His eye had already fallen on Anne Boleyn, and Henry wanted an annulment and not a divorce in his marriage with Catherine. In the eyes of God, he would never have been married at all, and then he could marry Anne Boleyn with a clear conscience. Here Wolsey's gift for diplomacy failed him, but perhaps it was an impossible task. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, who at the time was the most powerful man in Christendom. All of Wolsey's efforts to persuade the Pope to annul the marriage failed, partly because the Pope had already given Henry VIII a dispensation to marry his brother's widow. Wolsey's failure eroded his support with the king. Anne Boleyn likewise hated Wolsey, partly because she believed he was hindering the annulment, and partly because he had blocked her from marrying the Earl of Northumberland years before she had her eyes set upon Henry. Finally, Henry stripped Wolsey of his office of Lord Chancellor, and Wolsey retired to York to take up his role as Archbishop there. Wolsey's popularity threatened Henry and Anne, so Henry summoned him back to London to face treason charges. Perhaps fortunately for Wolsey, he died of natural causes on the journey back to London. His replacement as Lord Chancellor was Thomas More, the next of our major four Thomases. Number 2, Thomas More. More was an interesting contrast, a Renaissance humanist who remained a staunch Catholic, even though Renaissance humanists in general tended towards proto-Protestantism or actual Protestantism. He was also in some ways oddly progressive for his time. He insisted on educating his daughters at a time when it was considered pointless to educate women about anything other than the practical business of household management. Anyway, More's training as a lawyer and a scholar led him to a career in government. He held a variety of posts under Henry VIII, finally rising to become the Lord Chancellor after Wolsey. In the first decades of his reign, Henry was staunchly Catholic and despised Protestantism, in particular Lutheranism in general, and Martin Luther in particular. In 1521, Henry published Defense of the Seven Sacraments against Luther, and More helped him write it to an unknown degree. In their dislike for all forms of Protestantism, More and Henry were in harmony at this point. More was involved in hunting down heretics, i.e. Protestants, and trying to convince them to recant. During his time as Lord Chancellor, More ended up sending 6 people to be burned at the stake for heresy, along with the arrests and interrogations of numerous others. This rather clashes with his humanist man of letters aspect, but More was undoubtedly convinced he was doing the right thing, and while he might have believed in education, he most definitely did not believe in freedom of conscience in several areas. To be fair to More, in the view of many at the time, Protestants, especially Anabaptists, were dangerous radicals. Likely More viewed hunting heretics in the same way as some modern politicians view hunting down covert terrorist cells or surveilling potential domestic terrorists. Harsh measures true, but harsh measures allegedly necessary for the greater good of the nation. However, the concord between More and Henry would not last. Henry wanted to set aside Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, which More staunchly opposed. More especially opposed Henry breaking away from Rome and becoming head of an independent English church. At first, More was able to save himself by maintaining his silence, but eventually Henry required all of his subjects to take an oath affirming his status as head of the church. Thomas Cromwell famously led a deputation to try and change More's mind, but he failed. More refused, and he was tried on specious treason charges and beheaded in 1535. Later, the Catholic Church declared him the patron saint of politicians. This might seem odd given that he oversaw executions and essentially did thought police stuff against Protestants, but let's be honest. It's rare to see a politician even mildly inconvenience himself over a point of principle, let alone maintain it until death when he was given every possible chance to change his mind. Probably the most famous fictional portrayals of More are A Man for All Seasons and Wolf Hall. I would say that A Man for All Seasons was far too generous to More, but Wolf Hall was too harsh. Now for the third of our four Thomases, Thomas Cromwell. After Wolsey's fall and More's refusal to support Henry's desire to either annul his marriage to Catherine or to make himself head of the church so he could annul the marriage, Thomas Cromwell rose to become Henry's new chief lieutenant. Cromwell is both a fascinating but divisive figure. For a long time he was cast as the villain in Thomas More's saga, but Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall really triggered a popular reevaluation of him. Like A Man for All Seasons was too generous to More, I would say Wolf Hall was too generous to Cromwell. Nonetheless, I suspect Cromwell was and remains so divisive because he was so effective. He got things done on a scale that the other three Thomases of the English Reformation never quite managed. Cromwell's origins are a bit obscure. It seems he was either of non-noble birth or very low gentry birth, and his father Walter Cromwell was a local prosperous tradesman and a jack-of-all-trades with a reputation for litigiousness. For reasons that are unclear, Cromwell fled his birthplace and spent some time in continental Europe, possibly as a mercenary soldier. He eventually made his way to Italy and started working for the merchant families there, gaining knowledge of trade and the law, and then traveled to the Low Countries. When he returned to England, he became Cardinal Wolsey's right-hand man. After Wolsey's fall, Cromwell went into Parliament and defended his master whenever possible. This loyalty, combined with his significant talent for law and administration, caught the eye of Henry, and he swiftly became Henry's right-hand man. Amusingly, Cromwell never became Lord Chancellor like More or Wolsey, but instead accumulated many lesser offices that essentially allowed him to carry out Henry's directives as he saw fit. Unlike More or Wolsey, Cromwell had strong Protestant leanings, and he encouraged the king to break away from the Catholic Church and take control of the English Church as its supreme head. Henry did so. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was annulled. The rest of Europe never accepted this until Catherine died of illness and it became a moot point. And in 1533 he married Anne Boleyn. Like Cromwell, Anne had a strong Protestant bent and began encouraging reformers to take various offices and began pushing Henry to make more reforms than he was really comfortable doing. For example, Cromwell was one of the chief drivers behind the English Bible of 1539. This, combined with Anne's inability to give Henry a son, continued to Anne's downfall. Unlike Catherine, she was willing to argue with Henry to his face, and was unwilling to look the other way when he wanted a mistress, and this eventually got on Henry's nerves. Events are a bit murky, but it seems that Henry ordered Cromwell to find a way he could set aside Anne, and Cromwell complied. Various men, including her own brother, were coerced into confessing to adultery with Anne on charges that were most likely fabricated, and Anne's quote-unquote lovers and Anne herself were executed for treason in 1536. Cromwell had successfully used a technique that many modern secret police organizations and dictatorships employ. If you want to get rid of someone for whatever reason, accuse them of a serious crime, coerce them to a confession, and then have them executed. Joseph Stalin did basically the same thing when he purged the old Bolsheviks after Lenin's death. Henry married Jane Seymour shortly after Anne's execution, and she finally gave Henry his long-awaited son, though she died soon afterwards of postpartum complications. Cromwell also oversaw the dissolution of the English monasteries in the 1530s. Monasticism had become quite unpopular even before the Reformation, especially among humanist writers, and the concentration of property in the hands of monasteries made for a ripe target. Using Parliament and with Henry's approval, the monasteries of England were dissolved, the monks and nuns pensioned off, and the various rich properties held by the monasteries were given to the king and his friends. Cromwell himself profited handsomely. This was essentially legalized theft, but there was nothing the monasteries could do about it. Cromwell pushed for more religious reforms, but that combined with the dissolution of the monasteries called the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1537, a rebellion that Henry was able to put down through a combination of lies, stalling, outright bribery, and brutal repression under the Duke of Norfolk. More about him later. Cromwell was at the zenith of his power and influence, but his reformist bent had made him a lot of enemies. For that matter, Henry was increasingly uncomfortable with further religious changes. He wanted to be head of his own church, but essentially his own Catholic church, not his own Reformed or Lutheran one. Cromwell's alignment with the Reform cause gave his more traditionalist enemies a tool to use against him. Cromwell's foes had their chance in 1540 when Henry married his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Cromwell had heavily pushed for the match, hoping to make an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. For whatever reason, Henry took an immediate dislike to Anne and never consummated the marriage, which was swiftly annulled and Anne pensioned off. Henry blamed Cromwell for the failed marriage, and Cromwell's enemies, particularly the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner of Winchester, were able to convince Henry to move against him. Cromwell was arrested, stripped of all the titles and property he had amassed, and executed in July of 1540. The sort of legal railroading process he had poured against Anne Boleyn's alleged lovers and numerous other enemies of Henry's was used against him. This was one of the very few executions Henry ever regretted. Within a year, the French ambassador reported that Henry was raging that his counselors had misled him into putting to death the most faithful servant he had ever had. Once again, nothing was ever Henry's fault in his own mind. The fact that Henry allowed Cromwell's son Gregory to become a baron and inherit some of his father's land shows that he likely changed his mind about the execution. For once in his life, Henry was dead-on accurate when he called Cromwell his most faithful servant. He never again found a lieutenant with Cromwell's loyalty and skill, and the remaining 7 years of Henry's reign blundered from setback to setback, and all the money Henry obtained from the dissolution of the monasteries was squandered in indecisive wars with France and Scotland. I think it is fair to say that the English Reformation would not have taken the course it did if not for Cromwell. As ruthless and as unscrupulous as he could be, he nonetheless did seem to really believe in the principles of religious reform, and pushed such policies whenever he could do so without drawing Henry's ire. Now the fourth of our 4 major Thomases, Thomas Cranmer. If Thomas Cromwell did a lot of the political work of the English Reformation, then Thomas Cranmer wrote a lot of its theory. Cranmer was a scholar and something of a gentle-minded man, but not a very skillful politician, and he seemed happy to leave the politicking to Cromwell. I think Cranmer would have been a lot happier as a Lutheran pastor in, say, 1950s rural Nebraska. He could have married a farmer's daughter, had a bunch of kids, and presided at weddings, funerals, and baptisms where he could talk earnestly about Jesus and Christian virtues, and he could probably would have written a few books on obscure theological points. But instead, Cranmer was destined to play a significant part in the English Reformation. He started as a priest and a scholar who got in trouble for marrying, but when his wife died in childbirth, he went back to the priesthood. Later, he became part of the team of scholars and priests working to get Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. While he was at university and later in the priesthood, he became fascinated by Lutheran ideas and became a proponent of reform. As with Cromwell, Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn gave Cranmer his great opportunity. Anne's family were also in favor of reform, and they arranged for Cranmer to become the new Archbishop of Canterbury. The new archbishop and like-minded clerics and scholars laid the legal and theological groundwork for Henry to break with Rome and become head of the English Church, with Cranmer and the rest of the Reform faction wanted to use to push for additional church reforms. Cranmer survived the tumults of Henry's reign by total loyalty to the king. He mourned Anne Boleyn, but didn't oppose her execution, though he was one of the few who mourned for her publicly, did much the same when Cromwell was executed, and personally sent news of Catherine Howard's adultery to the king. Because of that, Cranmer had his great chance to pursue the cause of reform when Henry died and his 12-year-old son Edward VI became king. Edward's uncle Edward Seymour acted as the head of the King's Regency Council, and Seymour and his allies were in favor of reform. Cranmer was at last able to steer the English Church in the direction of serious reform, and he was directly responsible for writing the Book of Common Prayer and several other key documents of the early Anglican Church. But Cranmer's luck ran out in 1553 when Edward VI died. Cranmer was part of the group that tried to put the Protestant Lady Jane Grey on the throne, but Henry's daughter Mary instead took the crown. Mary had never really wavered from her Catholicism despite immense pressure to do so, and she at last had a chance to do something about it. She immediately brought England back to Rome and started prosecuting prominent reform leaders, Cranmer among them. Cranmer was tried for treason and heresy and sentenced to be burned, but that was to be commuted if he recanted his views in public during a sermon, which he did. However, at the last minute, he thunderously denounced his previous recantation, asserted his reformist faith, and vowed that he would thrust the hand that had signed the recantation into the flames first. Cranmer was immediately taken to be burned at the stake, and just as he promised, he thrust his hand into the flames, and his last words that he saw heaven opening and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Cranmer had spent much of his life trying to appease Henry while pushing as much reform as possible, but in his final moments he had finally found his defiance. When Mary died and Elizabeth took the throne, she returned England to Protestantism. Elizabeth was much more pragmatic than her half-siblings and her father ever were, so she chose the most expedient choice of simply rolling the English Church back to as it was during Edward VI's time. Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer and religious articles, lightly edited for Elizabeth's sensibilities, became the foundational documents of the Anglican Church. So these 4 Thomases, Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Thomas Cranmer, were central to the events of the English Reformation. However, we have one bonus Thomas yet. Number 5, bonus Thomas, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Thomas Howard was a powerful nobleman during the reign of Henry, and the Duke of Norfolk was frequently Henry's lieutenant in waging various wars and putting down rebellions. He was also the uncle of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, Henry's 2nd and 5th queens. He was also involved in nearly every major event of Henry's reign. So, with all that, why isn't Norfolk as remembered as well as the other four Thomases of the English Reformation? Sometimes a man would be considered virtuous by the standards of the medieval or early modern age, yet reprehensible in ours. For example, for much of the Middle Ages, crusading was considered an inherently virtuous act for a knight, whereas in the modern age it would be condemned as warmongering with a religious veneer. However, by both modern standards and Tudor standards, Thomas Howard was a fairly odious character. For all their flaws and the morally questionable things they did, Wolsey, More, Cromwell, and Cranmer were all men of conviction in their own ways. More and Cranmer explicitly died for their faith. Cromwell's devotion to the Protestant cause got him killed since he insisted on the Anne of Cleves match. Even Wolsey, for all that he enriched himself, was a devoted servant of Henry, and after his downfall never betrayed the king. By contrast, Norfolk was out for Norfolk. This wasn't unusual for Tudor noblemen, but Norfolk took it to a new level of grasping venality. He made sure that his daughter was married to Henry's bastard son Henry Fitzroy, just in case Fitzroy ended up becoming king. He used both his nieces, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, to gain power and lands for himself, and then immediately turned against them once it became politically expedient. In fact, he presided over the trial where Anne Boleyn was sentenced to death. After the failure of the Anne of Cleves marriage, Norfolk made sure to bring his young niece, Catherine Howard, to court to catch Henry's eye, and to use the Anne of Cleves annulment as a lever to get rid of Thomas Cromwell. Both stratagems worked, and he attempted to leverage being the new queen's uncle to bring himself to new power and riches as he had with Anne Boleyn. Once Henry turned on Catherine Howard, Norfolk characteristically and swiftly threw his niece under the bus. However, as Henry aged, he grew increasingly paranoid and vindictive, and he had Norfolk arrested and sentenced to death on a suspicion of treason. Before the execution could be carried out, Henry died, and Norfolk spent the 6 years of Edward VI's reign as a prisoner in the Tower of London. When Edward died and Mary took the throne, she released Norfolk, since she was Catholic and Norfolk had always been a religious traditionalist suspicious of reform. He spent the remaining year of his life as one of Mary's chief advisors before finally dying of old age. Conclusion. As I often say, history can be a rich source of inspiration for fantasy writers, and the English Reformation is full of such inspiration. Wolsey, More, Cromwell, and Cranmer could all make excellent inspirations for morally ambiguous characters. For that matter, you can see why the reign of Henry VIII has inspired so many movies, TV shows, and historical novels. The real-life events are so dramatic as to scarcely require embellishment. So that's it for this week. Thank you for listening to The Pulp Writer Show, and thank you for listening as I went on one of my little historical digressions. I hope you found the show enjoyable. A reminder that you can listen to all the back episodes on https://thepulpwritershow.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review in your podcasting platform of choice. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you all next week.